For years, Kenneth Copeland stood as one of the most powerful figures in televangelism. His sermons reached millions, his wealth was unmatched, and his influence stretched far beyond the walls of his ministry. To his devoted followers, he was a man of deep faith, a leader who claimed to have a direct connection to God. But to his critics, he was a figure shrouded in controversy, a man who had built an empire not just on faith but on financial power and control. Then came the trial, a legal battle that had been years in the making. Allegations of financial misconduct, fraudulent practices, and misuse of ministry funds had finally caught up to him. The case drew national attention, filling the courtroom with lawyers, journalists, and spectators, all waiting to see if one of the most well-known televangelists in history would finally face justice. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Copeland sat rigid in his chair, his face carefully composed, though there was an undeniable tightness in his jaw. For years, he had dismissed allegations against him as attacks on his faith. But today, he could no longer ignore the weight of the law pressing down on him. The judge's voice was firm and deliberate as the verdict was read aloud. Each word seemed to strike like a hammer, echoing through the silent courtroom. Then the sentence was delivered, a heavy punishment, one that even Copeland, with all his influence and resources, had not expected. The room erupted with gasps and murmurs. Some of his supporters clutched their mouths in shock, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The once powerful preacher, who had commanded audiences with unwavering confidence, now sat frozen in place. And then it happened. His body swayed slightly as his breathing became shallow. His face, usually so controlled, paled as realization set in. Before anyone could react, his body gave way, and he collapsed onto the cold, hard floor of the courtroom. Gasps turned into shouts as people rushed toward him. Some called for help, while others stood in stunned silence, unsure if they had just witnessed a moment of sheer physical shock or something even more serious. News of his collapse spread like wildfire. Within minutes, headlines flashed across television screens and social media platforms. Kenneth Copeland collapses in court after hearing his sentence, the story everyone was talking about. Some speculated that the stress had finally taken its toll, while others questioned whether it was a strategic move, a final attempt to delay justice. As paramedics arrived, lifting his motionless body onto a stretcher, the world was left with more questions than answers. Was this truly the end of Kenneth Copeland's reign? Or was this just another chapter in the long and complicated story of one of televangelism's most controversial figures? The courtroom had been filled with anticipation long before the final verdict was announced. This trial was unlike any other. It wasn't just about legal consequences, it was about the fall of a man who had built an empire on faith and financial power. For decades, Kenneth Copeland had stood before massive audiences, preaching prosperity and divine favor. He told his followers that faith would bring them wealth, that giving to his ministry would result in blessings beyond imagination. But behind the scenes, investigations uncovered a different story, one that led to this very moment. The charges against him were severe. Prosecutors accused him of misusing ministry funds, evading taxes, and manipulating donations for personal gain. Luxury jets, sprawling estates, hidden financial dealings. Evidence had piled up over the years, painting a picture of a man who had lived lavishly while his followers sacrificed in the name of faith. For years, Copeland had dismissed these claims as attacks from the enemy, calling them persecution against his ministry. But now, standing before the court, there was no pulpit to shield him, no sermon to turn the tide. Throughout the trial, he remained composed, his expression unreadable. His lawyers argued that every dollar spent had been justified, that his lifestyle was a reflection of God's blessings, not greed. His supporters filled the courtroom, some holding on to their Bibles, praying that their leader would walk free. But outside the courthouse, crowds of protesters demanded justice, holding signs that read, "No one is above the law," and "Faith is not a business." As the final day of trial arrived, tension ran high. The judge's voice was steady, firm as he began reading the verdict. A hush fell over the room. Kenneth Copeland sat still, listening intently. His lawyers exchanged nervous glances, sensing what was coming. Then the words were spoken. Guilty. The room remained silent for a moment, as if time itself had stopped. Then a wave of reactions swept through the crowd, gasps, whispers, a few audible sobs from his supporters. And in that moment, something in him broke. His breath became unsteady. The weight of reality, of years of avoiding consequences, of believing he was untouchable, came crashing down at once. Before anyone could react, Kenneth Copeland's body gave way, and he collapsed to the floor. For the first time in his life, there were no cameras he could control. No congregation to reaffirm his power. Just silence, the weight of justice, and the uncertain fate of a man who once claimed to speak for God himself. To reassure him, there was no escape from the truth. This was not a stage. This was real. And the world was watching. The courtroom descended into chaos the moment Kenneth Copeland collapsed. Gasps filled the air as his body hit the floor, his once commanding presence reduced to complete stillness. For a brief moment, no one moved. Shock froze everyone in place. Then, the room erupted. Lawyers rushed to his side. His supporters cried out in panic. Security officers stepped in to control the rising commotion. The judge, who had just delivered the verdict, remained still, observing the scene with a firm, unwavering gaze. Someone called for medical assistance as murmurs swept through the crowd. Is he breathing? Is this real? Did he just pass out? Some believed the weight of the verdict had been too much for him to bear. Others whispered among themselves, questioning whether this collapse was genuine or a dramatic attempt to delay his sentencing. Paramedics arrived swiftly, pushing through the confusion with a stretcher and medical equipment. They knelt beside Copeland, checking his pulse, shining a small light into his eyes, searching for any sign of response. His skin had gone pale. His breathing was shallow. A hush fell over the room as they worked, transforming the once explosive courtroom into a tense, almost eerie silence. His most loyal followers stood nearby, hands clasped in prayer, whispering scripture under their breath. Some wept, unable to believe that the man they had seen as invincible now lay motionless before them. But among the spectators, there were others, people who had fought for justice, who had waited for this moment, who believed this collapse was nothing more than theatrics. Their faces showed no sympathy, only skepticism. He played the system for years, one muttered. Now he's playing the victim. The paramedic stabilized him, carefully lifting his limp body onto the stretcher. Camera flashes from journalists inside and outside the courtroom lit up the moment. Security escorted the medical team through the crowd as reporters scrambled to capture the unfolding scene, already preparing their breaking news headlines. Kenneth Copeland collapses after hearing his sentence. Medical emergency or convenient escape? Shocking courtroom drama. Televangelist faints as judge delivers verdict. Justice served. What happens next for Kenneth Copeland? As he was wheeled out of the courtroom, questions remained. Was this a true medical crisis brought on by the crushing reality of his fate? Or was this another carefully crafted act, a desperate move to delay what was coming? The world would soon find out. But one thing was clear: no amount of influence, no amount of wealth, and no amount of faith-based rhetoric could change the fact that justice had finally caught up with Kenneth Copeland. As Copeland was rushed out on a stretcher, the chaos did not subside. If anything, it only intensified. The corridors of the courthouse filled with reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing in every direction, desperate to capture the moment that would soon dominate headlines. Outside, a divided crowd reacted in starkly different ways. His devoted followers stood in stunned silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. His critics shook their heads, convinced that this was nothing more than a performance. Inside the courtroom, attorneys and officials attempted to regain control of the situation. The judge remained at his bench, unwavering despite the unexpected turn of events. The legal system would move forward. Copeland's collapse, real or not, would not change the verdict. His sentence had been delivered, and no amount of delay could undo the decision that had been made. Meanwhile, in the ambulance, paramedics worked quickly, monitoring his vital signs and administering oxygen. His pulse was weak but steady. One of the paramedics exchanged a glance with her colleague. "He's showing signs of extreme stress," she muttered. Could be a panic attack. Could be something more serious. The man lying before them, once a symbol of unwavering confidence and control, now appeared frail and powerless. His world was slipping out of his grasp. By the time they reached the hospital, speculation had already flooded social media. Some claimed Copeland had suffered a genuine medical emergency, overwhelmed by the weight of the verdict. Others were convinced it was a calculated move, a final attempt to manipulate the system. Talk show hosts and legal analysts debated the incident live on air, each offering their own perspective on what this collapse truly meant. Inside the hospital, doctors conducted a series of tests. His condition remained stable, but the stress of the trial had clearly taken a toll. Whether or not he had collapsed due to an actual health crisis, one truth remained. The verdict was real. The sentence was real. And no amount of time in a hospital bed would erase the fact that the law had finally caught up to him. As the news cycle continued, people across the world waited for updates. Would he recover quickly and return to fight his legal battles? Or would this moment mark the permanent downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Kenneth Copeland's reign had come to an end. The empire was crumbling, and the world was watching every second of its collapse. What had once seemed unshakable was now unraveling in real time. Outside the hospital, a swarm of reporters stood vigil, their cameras aimed at the building, ready to capture any sign of movement, any glimpse of an official statement, or even the arrival of a key figure from Kenneth Copeland's inner circle. But the only thing that filled the air was silence, an eerie, suffocating quiet that left the public hanging in suspense. Hours turned into days, and updates on Copeland's condition remained scarce. Despite the high-profile nature of the situation, no spokesperson had come forward, no family member had addressed the media, and no press release had been issued. The lack of information only fueled speculation. Inside the hospital, doctors monitored him closely. His vitals were stable, but his body showed clear signs of extreme stress. Some believed the collapse had been a consequence of both physical and psychological exhaustion, a man overwhelmed by the weight of his empire's downfall. Others whispered about a more calculated approach, a strategic medical episode that could serve as a legal maneuver, buying time to delay sentencing and potentially mount an appeal. While the outside world speculated, Copeland's most devout followers held onto their faith. Social media became a battleground of opinions. Supporters flooded platforms with messages of prayer, encouragement, and unwavering belief. "The enemy is trying to silence a man of God," one post declared. "Stay strong, Brother Copeland. This is just a test of faith." But not everyone saw it that way. Critics responded with unfiltered disdain. "This isn't spiritual warfare. This is justice," one comment read. "No one is above the law, no matter how powerful they think they are." Meanwhile, legal experts debated the possible outcomes. Would Copeland's team argue that he was too ill to serve his sentence? Could they successfully push for reduced punishment on medical grounds? Or would the courts see through any attempt to manipulate the system? The judge had already been firm in their decision, justice had been served, and no amount of theatrics would change that. Then, after days of agonizing silence, a statement finally emerged. Copeland's legal team announced that he was recovering from a serious health event and that they were actively exploring all legal options. But the words did little to sway public perception. The damage had already been done. His once mighty reputation had been irreversibly tarnished. No statement, no reassurances, and no declarations of divine intervention could reverse the reality of his situation. For decades, Copeland had preached about faith, how it could move mountains, how belief alone could triumph over adversity. But now, no sermon, no prayer, and no proclamations of favor could undo the chain of events that had led to his downfall. Whether he walked out of that hospital or remained under medical supervision, one truth remained. His empire was in ruins, and the world had watched its collapse unfold in real time. As the weeks passed, the public remained captivated, waiting to see what would happen next. His followers held on to hope, convinced that he would rise again, stronger and ready to fight what they saw as an unjust persecution. His critics, however, viewed this as the inevitable fall of a man who had built his empire on deception and unchecked power. Inside the hospital, doctors continued to assess his condition. Though he had stabilized, the stress had taken a visible toll on him. The once confident televangelist who had commanded massive stadiums and dominated television screens with his fiery sermons now looked like a shadow of his former self. His face, once filled with an almost defiant energy, now bore the weight of an uncertain future. His legal team worked tirelessly, filing motions and searching for any avenue to delay or lessen his sentence. Some legal analysts speculated that his medical condition might be used as a strategic argument, an attempt to depict him as too fragile to serve time. But the justice system was not so easily swayed. The courts had already spoken, and there was little patience for manipulation. As days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of Copeland's scandal spread through his ministry. The financial backbone of his empire, donations, began to dry up. Longtime supporters who had once given generously now hesitated, questioning everything they had believed in. The unraveling faith of his followers was evident in the dwindling numbers at his ministry's headquarters. Some staff members distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a controversy that threatened to stain their own reputations. The grand machine that had once operated like a well-oiled empire was now showing cracks too deep to repair. Television networks that had once aired his sermons now quietly removed them from their programming. Major Christian organizations, once eager to align themselves with him, issued cautious statements, some subtly condemning his actions while others remained frustratingly neutral. The televangelist who had once been a towering figure in religious broadcasting was now facing a reckoning unlike anything he had ever experienced. Meanwhile, the legal battle continued. Courtrooms remained filled with analysts dissecting every motion, every argument, and every new development in his case. Some legal experts believed that the prosecution had a strong case and that Copeland's team was simply stalling for time. Others suggested that, even if he were to evade the harshest penalties, his credibility had already been permanently destroyed. Public trust, once so deeply entrenched in his persona, had been shattered beyond repair. As news reports continued to roll in, interviews with former associates and former followers painted a complex picture of the man behind the pulpit. Some described him as a charismatic leader who had lost his way. Others accused him of deliberate manipulation, using faith as a means to accumulate wealth and power. The debate raged on, but one undeniable fact remained. His empire had crumbled, and the world had seen it all unfold before their eyes. In the midst of this chaos, Copeland's once mighty presence was reduced to a hospital room, surrounded by uncertainty. Would he walk out of this a free man, a fallen leader, or something else entirely? The answer remained unknown. But as the world continued to watch, one thing was clear: his story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter, one that neither he nor his followers had ever anticipated.